International news now.
So now we want to talk about how a series of domestic political factors are shaping American policy towards North Korea. The two countries have been locked in a significant political and military dispute over the North Korean nuclear weapons program during the Trump administration. Now, while the tensions have retreated some over the past month, we want to draw your attention to an important development last week that placed this issue back on the national political agenda. We're going to approach this story from a couple of angles. The first highlights the challenge the Trump administration is facing with respect to staffing the foreign policy bureaucracy of the executive branch. The second issue raises issues associated with congressional oversight over any decision to launch a war. So let's start here with a little bit of background. Now, North Korea has long been held up as one of the main adversaries and threats to the United States and its key allies in Asia in the post-Cold War world. The Bush administration labeled North Korea as part of the axis of evil following the attacks on 9/11. It also presented North Korea as a threatening rogue nation in the Bush national security statement that we read for this class. The U.S. has always voiced strong opposition to North Korea's nuclear program, and it has seriously considered military strikes against North Korea multiple times because of their nuclear program in the last 25 years. Now, on January 1st of 2017, North Korean President Kim Jong-un declared that his country was in final preparations to test an intercontinental ballistic missile. North Korea then conducted a series of test launches of these missiles last year. On the whole, they were successful. Experts now agree that North Korea possesses the military capacity to execute a military strike against targets inside the continental United States. We know that North Korea has nuclear weapons. It conducted a successful test of one in September of 2017. There's still some uncertainty, though, about their capacity to execute a successful nuclear strike against the United States. Now, over the course of 2017, there was a steady escalation of public threats from President Kim Jong-un and President Trump. And this war of public statements, some of it through Twitter, was accompanied by a series of missile tests on the part of the North Korean government and military exercises by both the North Korean government and by the United States in coordination with its allies in Asia. This issue has been at the top of national security challenges facing the Obama and Trump administration. President Trump mentioned it in his State of the Union address last week, and reports tell us that this was the one key issue that Obama officials said was going to be the most pressing security issue facing the Trump administration during the handoff of power in December of 2016 and January of 2017. Now, most significantly for our purposes today, the Washington Post published an important op-ed from Victor Cha last week that raised the possibility that the Trump administration is actively considering the initiation of a preventive military strike against North Korea, potentially against its sites where it might have nuclear weapons. In this memo, Cha criticized this military option that's currently being debated within the administration over the possibility of launching this preventive military strike. The strike would be designed to give North Korea what has been called a bloody nose. It would not be launching a full-scale war. Instead, a limited military strike would signal American willingness to use military force to resolve the dispute over North Korea's nuclear program. The strategy is based on the expectation that escalation of the strike into a larger war in Asia would be controlled or limited by the ability of the United States to then deter retaliatory strikes against American allies in the region and the American homeland. The idea here is that the U.S. could launch a strike and then control or prevent escalation into a much larger war in the region that then spins out of control and potentially strikes the American homeland. So we're going to watch a quick video on this memo now, and then after that discuss some of the implications raised by the memo. Let's go ahead and run the clip.
Just hours before his State of the Union address on Tuesday,
North Korea's reckless pursuit of nuclear missiles could very soon threaten our homeland.
President Trump's administration dropped its plan to nominate Victor D. Cha for the ambassador to South Korea. Cha had a fallout with the administration over a plan to carry out a preventive military strike against North Korea. He's against what he called a bloody nose strategy in a Washington Post op-ed. He argues the administration is pushing for it. As part of a reoccurring annual military exercise, the U.S. and South Korea conducted drills that simulated strikes on North Korean nuclear and missile testing sites. And the U.S. military itself has been quietly prepping for a last resort war with North Korea. The idea behind the bloody nose strategy is to use military force against North Korea, but not so destructive that it would trigger a retaliatory strike. The most obvious target would be a nuclear site, but many of North Korea's missile building sites are unknown, and others are buried too deep underground to reach. Proponents argue that an early, limited strike could make North Korea think twice about continuing its nuclear program. On the other hand, it could be that floating an airstrike, combined with saber-rattling rhetoric, is just an elaborate psychological operation designed to get inside Kim Jong-un's head. But Cha and other experts have previously contended that a military confrontation is ill-advised.
This is not firing 59 Tomahawk missiles at an airbase in Syria, right, or dropping a bomb on a set of bunkers in Afghanistan. This would be a conflict like we have not seen.
His fear is that a bloody nose could quickly turn into a full-blown war.
So before we talk about this video and the memo some more, I want to pause for 20 seconds to get your reactions to the possibility of American military strike against North Korea. So that poll question is going to pop up now. Go ahead and answer it. We'll come back in 15 seconds. Okay, so let's talk about this memo now a little bit. It's significant for a number of reasons. The first focuses on the background, status, and identity of the author in the larger foreign policy community of the United States. Cha is a Republican. He served on the National Security Council under President George W. Bush. He was its top advisor on American policy to North Korea, and he's recognized as one of the foremost experts on American policy and North Korea in the United States today. He was in the midst of being appointed as the American ambassador to South Korea. In that position, he would have been the top U.S. official representing the United States on the ground there. The United States sent his name to the South Korean government in December of 2017. They quickly approved his appointment. Normally, administrations do not take this step of announcing the candidate to the host government until he or she has already received security clearance and the White House has signed off on the nomination. In short, in December, the Trump administration signed off and decided to appoint Cha as the ambassador to South Korea. Now, it appears that he either withdrew his name or the administration pulled his nomination in the last couple of weeks because he voiced opposition to the military strategy to target North Korea currently being discussed within the administration. Now, second, we have to talk about the content of this memo. It effectively broke with the administration on its North Korean policy and criticized the administration. Again, this is not traditional partisan criticism coming from from Democrats. This is criticism is coming from a Republican, a known and respected individual within the larger Republican foreign policy establishment. This is not typical partisan politics. This is about a deeper strategic disagreement with the administration. Cha is effectively arguing that the administration is seriously considering a really bad policy. Third, given that Cha was so close to being appointed, the timing of the withdrawal and the memo has given more credence to the possibility that this policy option is being given serious consideration within the administration. Cha's withdrawal is like a resignation based on policy differences, when an American official refuses to implement some policy because they disagree so sharply with it. While he hadn't been appointed yet as the ambassador, the disagreement is like his withdrawal or his decision not to take the post is like a resignation in that case. He would rather leave the post than implement a policy he fundamentally disagrees with. Now, news reports have suggested that support for this policy was a litmus test for the appointment. Reportedly, he was asked if he would support the bloody nose strategy if the United States went ahead and implemented it, and he said he couldn't. Fourth, I think it's worth spending some time with the substance of the op-ed and his disagreement with the administration. And so the best way to do that is just read through some direct quotes from his op-ed in the Washington Post. Again, this was published last week, I think on January 30th. And so let's start with the first one, and we'll have slides of these posted now. North Korea, if not stopped, will build an arsenal with multiple nuclear missiles meant to threaten the U.S. homeland and blackmail us into abandoning our allies in Asia. Kim Jong-un will sell these weapons to state and non-state actors. These are real and unprecedented threats. But the answer is not, as some Trump administration officials have suggested, a preventive military strike. This is important, and let's step back. And this disagreement is not about missing the threat posed by North Korea to the United States. If anything, Cha underscores the severity of the threat. Why is North Korea pursuing a nuclear weapons program? They want to threaten. Why are they pursuing the nuclear weapons? They want to be able to threaten the U.S. homeland, and potentially they want to be able to blackmail the United States into abandoning allies in Asia. Moreover, he says he's going to sell these things if he gets them to state and non-state actors. What does that mean? He already has them, but if sanctions come off and tensions ratchet up, Kim Jong-un is more likely to share this nuclear weapons technology and potential with state and non-state actors. The inclusion of non-state actors is significant in this op-ed. Why? Because he's saying he's going to sell them to terrorists too. So Cha, is making the argument this is a grave national security threat to the United States, but we can't launch a preventive military strike. Why? So let's now move on to the next slide. The rationale, and what he's doing here is he's challenging the underlying logic associated with the bloody nose strategy. The rationale is that a strike that demonstrates U.S. resolve to pursue all options is necessary to give the mercurial Kim a bloody nose. Otherwise, if the U.S., he will remain undeterred. In other words, if the U.S. doesn't act, then Kim will continue to press the limit, threaten allies, threaten the American homeland. Cha continues, quote, "Yet there is a point at which hope must give in to logic." This is important. If we believe that Kim is undeterrable without such a strike, how can we believe that a strike will then deter him from responding in kind? This is important here. Think about the underlying logic associated with the potential effectiveness of the bloody nose, that it can then strengthen rather than undermine deterrence. What Cha is saying, there's an important logical consistency here that poses significant threats to the United States. In the next quote, we're going to get some sense of the nature of these threats. So, quote, "Some have argued that the risks are worth taking because it's better that people die over there than over here. On any given day, there are 230,000 Americans in South Korea and 90,000 or so in Japan. These Americans would have to hunker down until the war was over. To be clear, the president would be putting at risk an American population the size of a medium-sized U.S. city, Pittsburgh, say, or Cincinnati, on the assumption that a crazy and undeterrable dictator will be rationally cowed by a demonstration of U.S. kinetic power." So Cha is asking people to consider, what are the costs of going wrong here? The costs are over 300,000 Americans at risk of being killed in a war in Southeast Asia, potentially held as hostages. The United States wouldn't be able to get them out of there. In other words, we should think about the consequences of a bloody strike or a bloody nose strike, it's not like the war will stay over there. Instead, the war will be brought on American citizens who are living in the region. In other words, we have to think about this as risking the homeland as well. We can't fight the battle solely in East Asia. So now let's bring the story current up to this week. On Monday, yesterday, a group of 18 Democratic senators wrote a letter to the administration voicing the opposition to the withdrawal of the Cha nomination. First, they criticized the administration for taking so long to appoint an ambassador to a key American ally. And let's take a step back and think about this. Key American ally, South Korea, the U.S. still doesn't have an ambassador in that position under the Trump administration. He's been in office now for nearly, well, over a year. This fits a larger pattern, though, within the foreign policy bureaucracy, particularly within the State Department. A number of positions continue to remain unfilled. Allies, other countries around the world, don't know who to talk to because there's nobody filling these posts. And this is the case, too. It sends a negative and potentially threatening signal to South Korea if we can't get the key advocate for American interests and the key person responsible for coordinating alliance relations between South Korea and the United States in the midst of a crisis over the North Korean nuclear weapons program. The U.S. government can't even get a representative on the ground. So this raises questions about the larger bureaucratic effectiveness of the foreign policy bureaucracy of the Trump administration. So that's one element of this critique or these concerns raised in the Democratic response or this memo that was sent to the administration yesterday. Now, the senators also voiced their opposition to the bloody nose strategy. And this is important, and they raised the possibility that the administration does not have the constitutional authority to launch such a strike against North Korea. The letter states that without congressional authorization, and think about the rules on congressional rights to the discussion about the authorization to use military force from the pre-class modules and our discussion of constitutional provisions on this. The president is supposed to go to Congress to launch a war. So the letter states, without congressional, and this is a quote, without congressional authorization, a preventative or preemptive U.S. military strike would lack either a constitutional basis or a legal authority. So this letter is significant for a number of reasons. First, we have to think about it in partisan terms. It reflects partisan differences over American policy relative to North Korea. It's significant that only Democratic senators signed off on this memo. It's not a display of bipartisanship, so we still need to think about it in partisan terms. Second, this memo, as I already mentioned, raises the possibility that Trump would not have constitutional authority to launch a bloody nose strike. And the argument here is partly that Democrats, if we continue to have this larger national conversation about this strategy, the argument that Democrats are going to make to try to force the administration into coming to Congress is that the bloody nose strike, we can't be guaranteed that it would be limited, that the U.S. would just launch a series of missile attacks like it did in Syria when the Syrian government used chemical weapons against its people. In this case, the Democrats would argue, we can't guarantee that the strikes will be limited. Instead, they're likely to lead to retaliation and will involve the United States in a larger war. If we know that these strikes will precipitate a larger war, then the Constitution tells us that you have to come to Congress first. And so this is about congressional oversight of the executive branch in implementing American foreign policy, and it illustrates the larger importance of checks and balances and how domestic institutions in the United States, the division of authority between the president, the executive branch, and Congress, shapes the ability of the president to implement foreign policy. Now, this conversation and debate also raises questions about the need to secure a new authorization to use military force, potentially with respect to North Korea. And here, it's important to kind of compare this with American policy towards Iraq in 2002 and 2003. So remember, President Bush goes to Congress in 2002, secures authority from Congress to launch a war against Iraq if necessary. So it has congressional authority to do so, gets that in 2002, launches the war in 2003. We have to ask, could Trump administration do a similar thing with respect to North Korea? Will he get authorization? Will he have a larger debate with Congress? And the challenges are, once you open that debate, it's a different partisan environment in 2018 than it was in 2002. 2002, we're in the aftermath of 9/11, consistent with the arguments that we talked about earlier in class about how war tends to increase the power of the president. What it did was effectively push the American public into, I shouldn't say push. During times of war, the public rallies around the president. This gives the president more authority and more leverage relative to Congress. The American public becomes more concerned about national issues. And so it was easier for President Bush to get through congressional authorization for the war against Iraq in 2002. Today we have a much more divided American electorate and congressional officials. And not only that is the U.S. hasn't been attacked yet. In the case of 9/11, an attack then created this national coherence that facilitated congressional approval for the war against Iraq. We don't have these same dynamics here. And if anything, a preemptive strike on the part of the Trump administration, given the partisan environment, could actually accentuate these domestic divisions rather than bringing them together. All of this complicates the potential to try and get congressional authorization for a bloody nose military strike against North Korea. But again, the reason why I wanted to talk about this is it raises core constitutional issues about how the branches of government jointly make a decision to go to war, to use military force, and the need to raise, and potentially the need to secure an authorization to use military force.